Okay, so today we're going to talk about rational and irrational numbers. Have you heard even of the word irrational before? In terms of math? Okay, so let's not talk about math for a second, just a second. If someone is acting irrational, what does that mean? They're what? Hostile, okay. What else can we say about someone that's being irrational? Crazy. They're acting crazy, like talking while their teacher's talking. That's craziness, right? So someone that's irrational is not making sense. They're acting like, if someone is saying that you're being very irrational, that means that you're not being like calm and down to earth and thinking clearly, okay? Now, the opposite then would be being rational. If you're being, I'm pausing because people are talking again while I'm talking. If you're being rational, then that means you're thinking clearly. You're like, what you're saying is making sense, okay? So when we are talking about numbers, we can kind of relate some of those definitions of rational and irrational to the numbers as well, okay? So there's actually a lot of different categories that we can put numbers into. But all of the numbers that we're going to talk about until you are at least probably a junior or senior in high school, or maybe not even until you're in college, they're all going to be called real numbers. Well, the other thing was down there for probably 10 minutes. Real numbers. So you've been learning about real numbers since, I don't know, whenever your parents started teaching you about numbers. I was going to say kindergarten, but a lot of you knew about numbers before kindergarten, right? And the first numbers that you learned were what? Okay. Those are called natural numbers. So natural numbers are 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. The numbers that you count with. So those are the first numbers that you learned about. Now the next set of numbers are whole numbers. Whole numbers. A lot of people exclude the natural number list and they just say everything is a whole number because there's only one number that's different about natural numbers versus whole numbers, and that number is 0. 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. Okay? So again, natural numbers start with 1, whereas whole numbers would include that 0 also. But when you were learning about numbers, like when your parents were teaching you how to count, they didn't start with 0, right? That's something that you probably couldn't understand when you were only 2 years old. What 0 even means, so there's nothing there. Okay. We understand that now, though. Okay, next on our list, we have something called integers. Raise your hand if you remember learning anything about integers last year. I'm not going to ask you what they are, don't worry. Okay, so about half of you remember the word. Okay. Any volunteers on what you remember an integer to be? A positive or a negative, right? A positive or a negative. So integers, again, just an example of a list here. So -3 or -2, -1, 0, 1, 2. Now this goes in both directions, kind of like a number line. But notice there are no fractions and no decimals. We'll put that little bit of, don't worry. So the number 2, okay, the number 2. The number 2 is an integer. The number 2 is a whole number. The number 2 is a natural number. And it's also a real number. So there's all these different things that I can call this number. All these different groups that I can put it in. Okay? Still see a couple people writing. Are you just catching up? Okay. So now I'm going to start talking about rational numbers. All of the things that we've talked about already, all of those numbers, natural numbers, whole numbers, integers, those are all rational numbers, okay? So, includes natural, whole, and integers. But it also includes some other things that I'm going to list. Rational numbers would also include all fractions. Whoa, I'm sorry. Yep. No. There's going to be... Good job. Thanks. I was looking for like this active inspire icon. So all fractions, and when I say all fractions, I really do mean all fractions. Whether they are positive or negative, whether it's a simplified fraction, unsimplified, improper fraction, mixed number, no matter what. If it looks like a fraction, then it is rational. Okay? All fractions. Rational numbers also include perfect squares. We learned about those yesterday, right? That's why we learned about them yesterday, or one of the reasons. Tell me what some of those perfect squares are. Remember I said those first 10 we really should know? Well, those are just like the whole numbers. Tell me what's inside the radical sign. Ooh. 1, 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 49, 80, 81. I like it. Now, some of you were very resourceful and you turned to the page in your notes and looked at it. That's using your resources. No, that's fine. You're using your resources. Others of you, that's why we were kind of pausing. You were thinking 2 times 2, 4 times 4, or 3 times 3, 4 times 4. So, and that's good. That's exactly what I wanted you to do when you were thinking about those perfect squares. Okay? So natural numbers, whole numbers, integers, all fractions, perfect squares, and the last thing I'm going to talk about is decimals. Now, it'd be nice if I could say all decimals, but that's not the case. There's 2 different types of decimals that would be considered rational. So the first type of decimal would be a terminating decimal. Terminating. So just like the Terminator or an exterminator, or if your job is terminated, what do you think terminate means? Destroyed, okay. If your job is terminated, you are fired. An exterminator does what? We need to get an exterminator to get the wasps out of here. What does an exterminator do? Kills bugs, okay. So these aren't numbers that kill or get fired. What all these words have in common, all these things have in common is it's stop, okay? So terminate means to stop. Your job is stopped if you're fired. Bugs are stopped if you kill them. The Terminator stopped the bad guys. Okay? So terminating means a decimal that stops. So you might want to add that word in there for yourself. You'll hear me say terminating. So we want to be familiar with that word, but we need to also know what it means. Okay? I'm going to put a couple examples in here for terminating, like 5.6. There's nothing after the 6, so it stops. Now, I know that I really could put as many zeros as I wanted behind that 6, but it doesn't change that it's still 5.6. Okay? I could say negative 0.125. So even though there's 3 digits after the decimal, it still stops. Okay? And even though it's negative, it doesn't matter that it's negative. All right? We have one more thing to say about rational numbers. One other type of decimal. And that other type of decimal is called a repeating decimal. So you should be familiar with what a repeating decimal is. Can anyone give me in their own words what a repeating decimal is? Continue. So that same digit keeps repeating over and over and over and over. Okay, good. So examples then. Now we can write repeating decimals 2 different ways, correct? For instance, I could say 0.444 ... So whenever you see the ... that always means it keeps going. That means an ellipse. That's what it's called. You don't need to know that word. You don't need to know the word ellipse. That's what that's called. But you do need to know that, different word. You do need to know that what it means is that it keeps going. What is the other way that you can write this? Okay, so what digit is repeating here? Is it 444 or 444? It's really just the 4, correct? Ladies towards the back, quit talking. I'm going to make a new seating chart, and it's all going to be because of you all. Easy killer. Don't be irrational. So I know that we have a 444 right here, but it's not really 444, 444. It's 4444. So we only want that one digit shown. And we would do it like that. Okay? So those are all the things that could be rational. And you may be thinking, what's even left? Like, what numbers are even possible to be irrational then? Well, that's what we're going to talk about next, okay? Actually, before I even do that, I'm going to show you kind of a visual thing to look at. So, what was the first word that we started with today? Real numbers, we started with then what? Then you turn the page. Problem solving. All right, so real numbers, what was that first thing that you all learned? What are those called? Natural. So we have natural numbers. Then we learned another number that made it now a new category called whole numbers. Whole numbers includes the natural numbers. If you don't want to write this picture, it's okay. I want you to understand what I'm doing that with this picture. Okay? So we have natural numbers. Then we have whole numbers, but the whole numbers include the natural numbers. Then we have what? It's in your notes. Natural, whole, integers. Integers. So integers include natural. Integers include whole numbers. And then integers, they have other integers too that are not considered natural or whole. And then all of these things, plus a few other things, are considered rational. Okay? So it's kind of like some people are more visual than words or lists. And I am going to have you, when you have to sort numbers, I'm going to give you numbers and I'm going to have you put them in the best category. For instance, if I said -4, where would be the best category for -4? Integers. So I would put the -4 in my integer column. What about if I said 1/2? 1/2 would be best in what category? The only category. What? Rational. What if I said 0? Whole numbers. What if I said, no, I'm not going to do it because you said it. What if I said the square root of 25? It equals 5, but what category? Well, I see what you're doing there, because you're thinking square root of 25 equals 5, which is natural. But as it's written like that, it's written as a perfect square, right? So let's go ahead and put it in rational. What about the number 13? Natural. Okay? So all of these numbers are rational, but they all can be described a little bit more specifically. Okay? All right. Now let's move on to talk about irrational numbers. What? Jenna. Come here. I assume, I don't know, maybe you're leaving? Okay. It just says sign out, so. Jenna, do you want to take the assignment with you and try? See if I can reach over here. There it is if you want it. All right, so irrational, not nearly as many things to list. Non-terminating decimals.